morning, everyone, and welcome to the Insight APSAD webinar series. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians on the land of which this event takes place. I'm coming to you today from Meanjin on the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara people. I'd also like to extend that acknowledgement to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are joining us today from across the web. I have the pleasure today of facilitating a webinar on image and performance enhancing drugs, which is being delivered today by Karen Blakey. Karen may be familiar to a lot of you who join us on our regular webinars, as she is a regular presenter for us, and we're very fortunate for that. So Karen is a senior chemist in the forensic chemistry laboratory at Queensland Health. So the forensic and scientific services have been working in illicit drug analysis for more than 20 years. And the illicit drug group in the lab analyses approximately 18,000 seized drug exhibits from across Queensland every year, which includes a variety of performance and image enhancing drugs, which range from anabolic steroids to cognitive enhancers. Please feel free as we go through the webinar to post questions for Karen in the chat. I'll collate them to ask at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Karen. So welcome, Karen.
Thank you very much, Samantha. Good morning, everyone, and thank you to Insight for the opportunity to come and talk about this broad and I think quite interesting group of compounds, the image and performance enhancing drugs, or IPEDS. Now, we also commonly refer to them as performance and image enhancing drugs, or PEDS. You'll see them referred to as human enhancement drugs, along with a range of other names. Today, I'm going to be giving an overview of the types of IPEDS that we see in Queensland drug seizures. We won't have time to cover everything, but we'll get through a lot of them, including the anabolic androgenic steroids, some compounds that people may use to mitigate the side effects of steroids. And within the last 5 years or so, we have seen an increase in selective androgen receptor modulators, or SARMs, and also some compounds that can be sold as SARMs, but are better described as metabolic modulators. And we'll have a quick look at some hormones and peptides, beta agonists, fat burners, and cognitive enhancers. Now, I've shown these groups as discrete different groups, but there is some overlap between them. From a chemistry point of view, the drugs in this group are quite diverse, but what groups them together is that they're used to enhance or modify physical appearance, things such as musculature, weight loss, or even tanning, or to enhance or modify performance, be that physical or cognitive. One of the main things I'm going to focus on in this presentation is examples of mis-selling in the IPED market. There's certainly extensive reports in the literature and a lot of discussion online indicating that this won't come as a surprise to many people, but we'll have a look at it from a Queensland context. Now, the title of this talk is a little bit flippant, talking about getting ripped off and suggesting that there may be a financial concern if a product doesn't contain what's on the label, and that may be a valid concern. But what may be of more concern is how the potential health risk may change or be amplified due to the presence of undisclosed substances. Now, before we get too much further into it, I just want to go through what I'm going to call my caveats and disclaimers, or terms and conditions slide. There are some limitations when you're looking at seized drug data. Firstly, it only represents a proportion of what is in the community, and that proportion may be influenced by police operational priorities. It can also be influenced by the testing requirements or the capabilities of the analytical laboratory. And often with seized drug data, it's difficult to get a clear picture of how much mis-selling is occurring because we don't have clear information about what the products are being sold as. This is less significant with IPEDS because a lot of the products we see are actually coming in labeled containers, so we do have that information. Now, as Samantha mentioned in my bio, I am a chemist, and the role of the laboratory where I work is to chemically identify compounds in seizures of suspected illicit drugs. I'm not a medical professional or a toxicologist, so I will be making some brief statements about how some of these drugs work in the body, but please keep in mind you're getting this information from a chemist. Other things I'm not include a police officer or a lawyer. So again, I'll be making some brief comments about how some of these compounds sit in legislation. You certainly shouldn't be any inference taken from anything that I'm saying that a particular compound may be legal. Lastly, I've assumed that an insight audience, one of the topics that may be of interest would be some harm reduction information about people who use IPEDS. And again, this isn't really my area of expertise, hopefully providing some information about the types of compounds that we see in Queensland may be of assistance, but there are a number of other resources, including a podcast from New South Wales Health last month that was talking about some harm reduction strategies, also information provided by the Human Enhancement Drugs Network. There is an excellent book available for download from the Insight website on steroids that talks about harm reduction, and also some government sites like Sport Integrity Australia and the TGA also provide some general information about IPEDS and some risks of IPED use. So we will start off with the group that we will see most frequently, anabolic androgenic steroids. Now, in this context, the anabolic is referring to muscle building and the androgenic is referring to increased male sexual characteristics. It's important to note that not all AAS will have the same anabolic androgenic ratio of activity, and this may contribute to people seeking out particular steroids. Now, a steroid generally is a compound that would contain the below 4-fused ring system in its structure. And there are a range of different steroid compounds from corticosteroids to phytosteroids. But when we're talking about anabolic androgenic steroids, we're generally talking about the male sex hormone testosterone and a range of related synthetic compounds. There are a number of legitimate medical and veterinary uses for this type of product, and there are a number of registered products available in Australia. Now, just to give a little bit of context to how anabolic steroids are legislated in Queensland, back in August 2000, there was a group of IPED compounds that was added to the Queensland Drugs Misuse Regulation in its own Schedule 2A. In September 2014, that changed and the steroid drugs were taken out of Schedule 2A and they were up-scheduled to Schedule 1, Part 2. Drugs that may be present in Schedule 1, Part 1 include things like methamphetamine, heroin, etc. The remaining IPED compounds were merged with other Schedule 2 compounds in the Drugs Misuse Regulation. Now, another change that occurred at that time is that there were whole weights listed for steroid drugs. So for example, in Schedule 3, Part 2, there is a whole weight of 50 grams and Schedule 4, Part 2, a whole weight of 5 kilograms. It would be relatively rare for us to see a seizure that exceeds that 5 kilogram weight, but it does happen occasionally. And whole weights are defined in the legislation and a little bit different to the other weights as listed. So they refer to the total weight of the drug and any other substance with which it is mixed or in which it is contained. So if you had 10 grams of liquid and a steroid drug was detected, the whole weight would be 10 grams. It doesn't refer to the actual pure weight of steroid in that liquid. Now, what that means is that in Queensland, we don't determine the purity of steroid drugs in drug seizures. So that's important for today's presentation because when I'm talking about products that are true to label, what I'm saying is that the active ingredient on the label was found to be the only active ingredient in the product, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the stated dose was correct. A couple of other points with legislation, steroid drugs, along with having a list of specified compounds, there is also another listing for any other anabolic and androgenic steroidal agent. So even a compound that's not mentioned by name, if it's deemed to fall within that category, may still be covered under the Drugs Misuse Regulation. Additionally, in the Drugs Misuse Act, there is a definition of an analogue of a dangerous drug, and that allows for certain chemical replacements or additions on the structure that may still cover a compound as a dangerous drug. Okay, so the main types of AAS that we would encounter would be liquids for injection, tablets and capsules, and to a lesser extent, we will see some powders and pastes of apparent higher purity. We start for the liquids for injection. Primarily, we would encounter these as steroid esters in a carrier oil. And what I mean by esters is you'll have a modification of this hydroxy group. A chemical group will be added to create an ester, and some examples that people may have heard of would be a propionate ester, an enanthate ester, or a decanoate ester. Now, as this chemical group increases in size, generally the molecule will become more hydrophobic, so less soluble in water, more soluble in oil. And the effect of this is that the type of ester will influence how quickly the steroid, for example, testosterone in this case, enters the bloodstream. So it's important to note it's still testosterone that is the active steroid, but really it's changing the duration of action. For example, there is a medical product, Sustanon 250. It contains a mixture of 4 different testosterone esters. So you're essentially creating a staggered release of testosterone. Now, as we'll often see with illicit, underground, or black markets for drugs, if there are products with a certain recognizable name, that name will carry across into some of the branding that we see in the black market products. So it's not unusual for us to see testosterone products labeled as Sustanon or Sus. These are just some of the more common steroids that we would see, and some of the names that you may see on labeling. They are generally steroid esters with the exception of stanozolol, which is not an ester form. We see that as an aqueous suspension. Now, typically we'd see these types of exhibits in 10 ml vials, and referring back to that whole weight in Schedule 3, if you had 6 vials, usually you would be exceeding that Schedule 3 whole weight of 50 grams. We see a range of different carrier oils. They will often contain benzyl alcohol as a preservative and benzyl benzoate, which aids in the solubility of the steroid. The most common form of mis-selling that we would see in this type of product is the substitution of a single testosterone ester for whatever is on the labeled contents. In the past, testosterone propionate or testosterone enanthate were more common, but recently I have been noting that testosterone cypionate seems to be increasing in prevalence. So, for example, these 2 vials shown labeled as testosterone enanthate and decadurabolin both only contain testosterone cypionate. It's also not unusual for us to see a number of vials that won't contain any steroid drugs. We have a look at an example of a type of product that we see. The packaging is very professional, very pharmaceutical-like in nature. These 4 bottles on the left all came in sealed boxes. Now you can notice that the labeling is all consistent, but it doesn't really take a keen eye to see that there are some differences there. There's differences in the vial height, the cap color, some font on the labeling, even the color of liquid in the vials is different. Now, in this case, the purple cap was true to label and contained testosterone enanthate, and the 3 green caps unusually had a substitution of 4 different steroid esters into this product, which would be consistent with a Sustanon mix. And they also contain different carrier oils. So we're looking at certainly 2 separate formulations, not one oil in which different steroids have been added. One of the things that we don't know about mis-selling is how much is intentional and how much is just poor quality control. Even though the products may look pharmaceutical, I think you could be confident that they're not made under pharmaceutical conditions. We have a little bit of a closer look of the box from that example. You can see that it's indicating that it's derived from South America. Again, quite pharmaceutical looking in appearance. There are QR codes that will take you to a website that looks like a pharmaceutical website. We have expiry dates, batch numbers, etc. Some bottles will even have little scratch panels that you can scratch off and go to the website and enter a code to check for authenticity. I wouldn't necessarily be relying on these codes to be a true indicator of authenticity, though. Some of the sites suggest that if you check a code more than once, it will come up with a log of locations in case someone has checked it at a different place. But I have checked codes multiple times from different locations, and nothing ever comes up to flag that it's been checked previously. Other indicators on this specific product, you can see there's a logo on the lid, and that logo is replicated on the inside of the bottle underneath that label. The logo doesn't appear to be associated with the product on its website, but we have seen similar products said to be from a different pharmaceutical companies, Lox Laboratories, that actually use that label as well. And this one is said to be based from a German company. There may be some discussion that particular manufacturers' brands may be more reliable than others. That may not always be the case. For example, these multiple bottles, all with the same manufacturer's brand. The 4 on the left are all true to label and contained what they said, but the 3 on the right all just contained a testosterone ester. So it may not be a matter of some brands are more reliable than others. Now, I mentioned earlier that we will sometimes see carrier oils without any steroid drugs present. So if we look at these 6 bottles, the differences in the bottles are a little bit more subtle. There is a slight difference in the septum that's used to seal the bottle on the right, and the absence of an air bubble indicates that that bottle on the right has been filled to capacity. It did contain a higher amount of liquid than the other 5. But in this case, the differences weren't significant because there were no drugs detected in any of the bottles. And that is certainly something that is common for us to see across a range of different presentations. You can often see spelling errors in the steroid drug name on the labeling. For example, Trenbolone is shown here, and anthanate's another common one. In my experience, that's not necessarily an indicator of whether the content is genuine, just on how well the person who's made the label can spell. A question that gets discussed a little bit online is whether you can use the color of a steroid to give some indication of whether it's genuine, particularly around the steroid Trenbolone. And it is true that Trenbolone liquids are typically dark yellow to amber in color, but you will see those colors carry across into fake products. So for example, these 3 products on the left all have dark yellow amber liquids consistent with what you'd expect for Trenbolone, and are labeled as Trenbolone, but only contained a testosterone ester. Similarly, we may see those dark colored liquids in bottles labeled as Trenbolone where there are no drugs detected. And I have analyzed oils where you'll see components of sesame oil, very similar color, that's been labeled as fake Trenbolone. Occasionally, you may see those darker colored oils in other bottles labeled as different steroids. In this case, it was an indication that it was Trenbolone, even though the bottle was labeled as Boldenone. Now, you would assume that this is more of a deliberate attempt to deceive when you're using particular colored oils that match the labeling. We have seen this in other products, including stanozolol products, which typically presents, because it's an aqueous suspension, it presents as a white liquid. Now, the packaging for this exhibit looks very similar to a legitimate veterinary product. It contained a white liquid, but it didn't contain stanozolol, it just contained testosterone. So moving on to the oral steroids that we see, the steroids that we typically see in injectable form will commonly have a high first pass metabolism. So if they're taken orally, a large proportion of that will be metabolized before it actually gets into circulation. You can change the oral bioavailability by a chemical modification to the structure. And that is by adding an alkyl group to the 17 position. So in this example, this red line, we've added a methyl group and therefore created methyl testosterone. These compounds are referred to as 17 alpha alkylated steroids or 17 AA steroids. And they do have a known increased risk of liver toxicity. And again, there are legitimate medical products for use associated with oral steroids, such as Proviron and Andriol. Now, we will frequently see this, unsurprisingly, in tablet or capsule form and a range of some of the different tablets we've seen across the top there. Unlike the injectable steroids, there are no real clear patterns in the mislabeling. You will sometimes see them in concealed packaging where they're labeled, for example, as dietary supplements. You can see mixtures of steroids that are being sold as a single compound. And you can see fake products where there are no steroid drugs detected. Now, the tablets with the British dispensary logo, that snake and arrow indicated in the purple and green tablets up the top, were certainly more common in the past. They used to be one of the most common forms of oral steroids that we see, but they're much more rare these days. There is a general association between color and the steroid, but it's not always reliable. So, for example, stanozolol tablets will frequently but not always be yellow. Methasterone tablets will frequently but not always be pale blue. So I mentioned there's no real clear patterns, and just to give some examples of that, some capsules that were labeled as turinabol or 4-chloromethanedienone, but actually contained a mixture of two steroids, oxandrolone and oxymethylone. The reverse scenario, almost 7,000 tablets labeled as oxandrolone, but in this case, they actually contain turinabol. And we've seen examples from unrelated seizures of visually indistinguishable sealed bottles labeled as oxandrolone. In some cases, they contain turinabol. In some cases, they contain oxandrolone. Another example of 4 sealed bottles seized together. The top 2 bottles labeled as Anavar 10 milligrams oxandrolone, and the bottom 2 labeled as Winstrol 10 milligrams stanozolol. When you have a look at the contents of the bottles, there is a noted difference in the Anavar products, and that followed through to analysis. So one of those Anavar bottles actually contains stanozolol capsules. And again, this brings us back to the point of whether this would be intentional deception or poor quality control. When they've obviously got access to the packaging for both types of steroids, they have access to the drugs for both types of steroids. So whether those capsules have ended up in that bottle in error or a bottle was labeled incorrectly, it's difficult to know. We have seen other examples where bottles are labeled as oxandrolone and contain stanozolol. And the reverse situation, bottles labeled as stanozolol, in this case with a labeled dosage of 100 milligrams, which would be exceptionally high. Typically, they're labeled as a 10 milligram dosage. And the capsules contained oxandrolone and the SARM enobosarm, which we'll talk about a little bit later. One oral steroid in particular that I did want to mention is Methasterone. It's also known under the brand name Superdrol or methyldrostanolone. Again, it's a product that we've seen labeled as dietary supplements, and it was being sold in the United States for an extended period as a dietary supplement. In this example, they've given a bit of a hint that it contains methasterone by putting the chemical name on the label. We have also seen it sold as mebolazine, which is also referred to as dimethazine or DMZ. Now, this is an unusual steroid type compound. It actually consists of 2 methasterone molecules joined by a chemical bridge. So it's a methasterone dimer. And we will see methasterone sold as mebolazine, mebolazine sold as methasterone. And in some cases, a mixture of the two. These tablets contained methasterone and mebolazine, along with another steroid, methanedienone, a SARM, LGD4033, and a metabolic modulator, cardarine. So quite a mix there. Methasterone is certainly one of the oral steroids in which there are a number of case reports of liver injury associated with it. Now, we mentioned in the injectable steroids about the use of color, and that does carry through into tablets as well. I mentioned that stanozolol tablets are typically yellow in color, some examples of some genuine tablets we've seen, and a couple of examples of some yellow British dispensary logo tablets in which we would typically have expected to see stanozolol. But the tablets on the left were a mix of paracetamol and ibuprofen, and the tablets on the right a mixture, contained another steroid, methanedienone. Similarly, you may see these yellow tablets in products that appear to be a pharmaceutical appearance, even with shrink wrap plastic over the top of the bottle, so they are sealed. In this case, it's labeled as containing stanozolol, but instead contained the cough suppressant dextromethorphan. Another example of oral steroids in which there's a lot of discussion online about fakes and how to tell fakes is the product Proviron. It is a registered medical product in Australia. This is what the legitimate tablets look like. We have seen a number of examples of sealed blister packs labeled as Proviron that contain tablets of similar appearance, but no drugs are detected. It is worth noting, just in a zoomed in portion of that blister pack, there is an E missing off the Methasterone. And similarly, we have seen sealed blister packs that do contain Methasterone. Now, I think we've seen that high quality pharmaceutical-like appearance doesn't necessarily mean true to label. Not all of the packaging we see is aiming for a pharmaceutical type presentation. For example, Popeye, not pharmaceutical packaging. They have made multiple spelling errors in that quite brief labeling, but it was true to label. It did contain the steroid that it said it would. Some examples of the steroids we see that are more of apparent high purity, we will see them as powders, often in packaging concealed as food products or makeup. So for example, the purple Tang packets on the left contained a powdered form of testosterone propionate. The milk tea products containing testosterone cypionate, and down in the bottom corner, some strawberry jelly and milky tea powder packages that contain powdered forms of trenbolone ester. Sometimes we will see them in less distinctive packaging. So the Winnie, short for Winstrol, down the bottom contained stanozolol in apparent high purity. And we may also see liquids in concealed packaging. So for example, olive oil bottles that contained nandrolone esters. Some things that you may see in cases along with these include just general carrier oils like grapeseed oil and chemical supply bottles for the benzyl alcohol, benzyl benzoate, etc. that I mentioned earlier. Moving on to the anti-estrogens. Now, some steroids are readily converted to estrogens by the aromatase enzyme in the liver. Not all steroids are said to aromatize either to the same extent or at all. One of the side effects of this production of estrogens can be gynecomastia, or the development of breast tissue in males. And so we will often see anti-estrogen types products in conjunction with steroids. They can be used to reduce estrogen levels or reduce the effects of estrogens. A couple of different types of products. Firstly, the aromatase inhibitors, compounds such as anastrozole, letrozole, exemestane. Now, these do pretty much what their name suggests, and they inhibit the aromatase enzyme and reduce that conversion of the steroid to estrogens. There are also selective estrogen receptor modulators such as tamoxifen, and they will block the effects of estrogens at the receptor. Some of the common anti-estrogens that we see in products and some of the forms that we'd see now, anastrozole, letrozole, tamoxifen, exemestane are all used for the treatment of breast cancer. So one of the types of products we'll see will be diverted pharmaceutical products, so tablets, etc., in sealed blister packs. We do also see a number of other more black market presentations, so tablets and capsules, also liquids for oral dosing. We will occasionally see powders that are of apparent high purity, and in my experience, that's often with tamoxifen. They can come in concealed packaging. Again, dietary supplements is a common form. And we have also seen products that are labeled as containing steroids or SARMs that actually contain anti-estrogens. Aromatase is a little bit unusual compared to the others. It is a steroidal compound, and it's one that's sold online as an aromatase inhibitor, and as a general supplement, we have seen a few instances of that. So some examples of the packaging that we'd see, as I mentioned, in concealed packaging, we have anastrozole on the left labeled as a dietary supplement, and then a couple of bottles labeled as vitamins that contained anastrozole and tamoxifen. It's not unusual for some of these products to have labeling on there that states for research only and not for human consumption. In some cases, it will still state the name of the drug that may be present. In other cases, it's more obscure. Some examples of mislabeling with anti-estrogens. We have here 3 sealed bottles that are labeled as Clomid or Clomiphene. Now, Clomid is a brand name of a registered medical product. It's one that is used in fertility treatment, and it can be classed as an anti-estrogen, but it's said to increase the levels of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. You will see it referred to with steroid use being used in post-cycle therapy or PCT, and as an attempt to try and kickstart natural testosterone production and reduce some of the side effects of steroids. Now, in this case, the 2 sealed bottles on the left contain tamoxifen, another compound mentioned in PCT, and the 1 bottle on the right did contain clomiphene as labeled. We have seen bottles labeled as steroid, in this example, oxymetholone, that have contained anti-estrogens such as anastrozole, and the reverse situation where you'll have bottles that are labeled as an anti-estrogen, in this case exemestane, but it actually contained a steroid, methandienone. One of the other types of products that we will commonly see in conjunction with steroids are erectile dysfunction products. We will see pharmaceutical products such as Viagra and Cialis tablets. It is important to note that there are counterfeits of these tablets that may contain a different drug or a different dosage than what they're supposed to. We see a range of international pharmaceuticals. Kamagra is one that we would see commonly from India. And these types of products will present in a range of forms, from tablets, capsules, sublingual films, jelly, confectionery, even chewing gum. We also will occasionally see powders of apparent high purity, and in my experience, that would most often happen with tadalafil. And by far the most common type of mis-selling of this product is natural products or herbal products that actually contain undisclosed sildenafil or related compounds. So if a herbal product suggests that it may have a similar effect to sildenafil, that is probably because it may contain sildenafil. This example on the right here consisted of sublingual films that contained tadalafil, but as you can see from the packaging, it's just suggesting it's a mixture of ginseng and fenugreek, etc. Some of the advertised dosages on these products can be quite variable. So for example, for sildenafil from 100 to 800 milligrams, emphasis that it's on an advertised and not an actual dosage. And we do see cases where you'll see ED products in fairly indistinct white pellet style tablets, and then see steroid tablets in the same case of the same appearance. We've seen packaging where ED products have been given as a complimentary gift in conjunction with the steroid purchase, and cases where there will be mixtures of tablets that some contain steroid, some contain erectile dysfunction product. An example of one of the types of products that we've seen, these Vigor tablets contain undisclosed sildenafil, but they are giving a few clues away to what they may contain. The design of the tablet is very similar to legitimate Viagra tablets. And for those people that have memorized all the US national drug codes, they are using the drug code of Viagra on their bottle. Now there's stating to contain 800 milligrams. This would be 8 times the dose of a Viagra tablet. It's worth noting that the tablet itself only weighs 830 milligrams. So it would essentially have to be pure sildenafil pressed into tablet form and then coated to get anywhere near that dose. And this is just one of the many products that the TGA have issued a safety advisory for regarding undisclosed erectile dysfunction drugs. A selection of some of the other products that we have seen. Again, they're all labeled as herbal or natural products. The labeling of some is more subtle than others, trying to indicate what's present. TGA have issued safety alerts about a range of these products. It's worth noting that it's not only sildenafil or erectile dysfunction drugs that may be present. For example, the Lange Hao product down in the bottom right corner, TGA issued an alert saying it had sildenafil and chloramphenicol, a antibiotic present. Okay, moving on to the selective androgen receptor modulators, or SARMs. These are drugs that often developed by pharmaceutical companies, and they're being investigated for their potential to generate anabolic effects for conditions such as muscle wasting, osteoporosis, etc. There have been some clinical trials, but there are no SARMs approved for medical use. They're marketed or discussed online as a steroid alternative with potentially reduced side effects, but it is important to note that there have been some reported adverse effects on liver, heart, risk of stroke, etc. SARMs are classed as prescription-only drugs under the National Poison Standard. So there will be some SARMs that are listed by name, but there is also a generic grouping that covers SARMs generally. So they are prescription-only drugs. These are some examples of the SARMs that we would see more frequently. We will see them as liquids for oral dosing, capsules, and occasionally as tablets. As with the other groups of IPEDS, there will be fakes and mis-selling that occur with SARMs as well. One of the earlier cases of SARMs that we saw in the laboratory included about 27,000 of the black and white RAD140 capsules and about 22,000 of the yellow and black enobosarm capsules. Now, this came with a third bag, which contained about 19,000 yohimbine capsules. This is also a compound we'll see with IPEDS. It's advertised for use as a fat burner, but also with some erectile dysfunction treatment. Now, these were submitted to the laboratory as suspected steroids, but we don't know that whether they were being sold or labeled as steroids, or whether that was just the assumption of the person seizing them. A really good study that looks at SARMs from an Australian perspective purchased a number of products from Australian websites and showed that there is contamination and dosage variability present. So of the 111 products they purchased, 94 had the correct main ingredient, which sounds like a good start, but 90 of them were also contaminated with other IPEDs. And when they looked at dosage strength and homogeneity, that dropped down to 34 out of the 111 that they classed as good quality. And there have been similar studies overseas. This UK study looked at 20 products. 60% had an undeclared compound and 35% did not contain one of the label components. So with SARMs, we have seen cases of undisclosed SARMs, but again, there are some indicators on this labeling to try and suggest the content. So this product labeled as NanoLig is said to contain nano-enhanced peptide matrix, Lig 10 milligrams, and then herbal enhancers that actually contain the SARM LGD 4033, also known as Ligandrol. A similar product labeled as yam extract, but you can see the letters RAD in the batch number, and it contained the SARM RAD140. We've seen some variation in bottles seized together. So for example, these 4 bottles, again, we look for the physical differences there, of which there are some. One bottle has got a white background on the label. Another bottle has a clear glass bottle rather than an opaque bottle. And 3 of those bottles contain the SARM RAD140. One contained an anti-estrogen tamoxifen. Similarly, 2 other bottles seized together. One contained yellow liquid, one contained colorless liquid, which wouldn't be visible from the outside because of the color of the bottle. One was true to label and contained andrine. The other, again, contained an anti-estrogen, anastrozole. Sometimes we'll just see a substitution of one SARM for another. So this bottle labeled as RAD140 actually contained the steroidal SARM YK11. And similarly, a bottle labeled as Androgenic but contained a different SARM, enobosarm. We do come across cases where products will be mislabeled as containing SARMs. For example, this product was labeled as containing a mixture of 3 SARMs, LGD4033, RAD140, and YK11, even to the extent where it included the chemical structures of the compounds on the label. The Phoenix product was labeled as containing ostarine, also known as enobosarm, along with the metabolic modulator cardarine, and interestingly, a synthetic caffeinone, which isn't really a compound that you'd expect to see in this kind of mix, and a further product labeled as containing a mix of 3 SARMs. None of these products contained any SARMs. The only drug detected in all of the products was caffeine, and this may present a risk in and of itself if people are taking caffeine supplements and then taking additional supplements with undisclosed caffeine. And sometimes we'll just see products that are labeled as containing SARMs and no drugs are detected. Now, I mentioned early on that you will see some drugs that have labeling or are sold as SARMs when they are not actually SARMs, and that would include the metabolic modulators and some examples of the common ones that we have seen. Ibutamoren, often labeled as MK677, is actually a growth hormone secretagogue. It is said to increase growth hormone levels in the body and is advertised as something that will build muscle and improve recovery, and is a Schedule 4 prescription-only drug under the poison standard. Anabolic, also known as SR9009, a reverb agonist said to influence metabolic rate and circadian rhythm, something advertised as a fat burner and to increase endurance, again, a Schedule 4 prescription-only drug. And cardarine, also known as GW501516, a PPAR delta agonist, again advertised for something that you may use to decrease fat, increase endurance. This is a product that has been shown to cause cancer in animal testing at high doses. It is a Schedule 10 substance under the poisons standard, so it's prohibited for sale, supply, and use. Some more examples of the types of products we'll see in this group. Ibutamoren, we will see across capsules, liquids. It's one of the rare ones that we would see also in powder form and apparently of high purity. This powder form down the bottom here next to the tablet was actually submitted as suspected heroin. That's not to say it was being sold as heroin, but may have just been the visual presentation is what they believed it to be. We have seen products labeled as MK677 or ibutamoren that actually contained a steroid drug, and some products labeled as ibutamoren in which no drugs are detected. So pretty similar patterns across the groups. Cardarine is a compound that was originally investigated for the treatment of obesity and diabetes. It's been around in Queensland for a while, since 2012, and we typically see it in capsule or liquid form. Now, these 4 products down the bottom are all labelled as containing cardarine. None of them actually contained cardarine. One contained a SARM, one contained yohimbine, one was another product just with caffeine, and one had no drugs detected. The only product shown that actually contained cardarine is the one that didn't have it on the label, the bottle of LGD4033, which contained a mixture of that and cardarine. It's not something that we see frequently in Queensland. We've seen about 16 exhibits over the last 5 years. We have recently, though, seen a related product, GW0742, which is essentially just fluorinated cardarine. And this is something that we had seen advertised online as a potential cardarine replacement. Now, SR9009 or Anabolic and other reverb agonists are, again, drug candidates being investigated for treatment of metabolic disorders. They're not approved for clinical use. I have seen some discussion online both about oral use and injection, but have not come across any products that would indicate it's being sold in a form for injection. We typically see it in capsules and liquids for oral dosing. A recent product labelled as SR9009 did actually contain that drug, but also contained the related compound SR9011, and that was the first time that we've come across that in Queensland. Now, a quick look at some hormones and peptides. They will typically present as small vials of powder, often with sterile liquid water for injection along with them. Human growth hormone and melanotan-2 are by far the most common that we will see. Now, in this table, there's a list of some other peptides, AOD 9604, CJC 1295, etc. We have certainly seen instances of those more frequently in the past. They're relatively unusual to see that at the moment. We do see a number of vials that will be labelled as human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG. This is another compound discussed to increase follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and to be used in that post-cycle therapy to try and kickstart testosterone production. Similarly, we've seen labelled vials, though these weren't analytically confirmed, of human menopausal gonadotropin, or HMG, being used for a similar purpose. Now, human growth hormone has lots of perceived benefits, from muscle gain to anti-aging. Melanotan-2 is a compound that was earlier investigated as an erectile dysfunction treatment, but described usage and advertising now is more around its ability to stimulate melanin production and its use as a tanning agent. One of the most common forms of mislabeling is that we will see products that are labeled as containing human growth hormone, but actually contain melanotan-2. So, for example, those 5 products shown down the bottom all contained melanotan-2, including the 2 on the left that are labeled as human growth hormone. Beta agonists is another class of compounds that we will see with steroids. Now, these compounds are known to relax the airway muscles, and people may be familiar with the compound salbutamol, which is present in Ventolin inhalers. They also have perceived benefits as fat burners and to increase lean muscle mass. And the compound that we most frequently see would be clenbuterol. We see it in a range of different presentations, from tablets, capsules, liquids. We will also occasionally see it in gel forms in what would appear to be a diverted veterinary product. It would be true to say that when steroids were first added to legislation, it was much more common for us to see steroids in diverted veterinary products, but that's relatively rare these days. But still, with clenbuterol, we will see airway gel and Claire gel products. Now, one of the common forms of mis-selling for clenbuterol is either tablets that are labelled as clenbuterol that don't contain any drugs, and we will have seen a number of instances where a product is labelled as containing clenbuterol but actually contains salbutamol. I'm not sure the reason behind that substitution. From a Queensland point of view, both clenbuterol and salbutamol, with the exception of Ventolin inhalers, are classed as dangerous drugs under the Drugs Misuse Regulation. Okay, fat burners. One of the fat burners that has been flagged as being of most concern is 2,4-dinitrophenol. Now, this is a compound that prevents energy being stored as fat. It results in that being released as heat, which raises the body temperature, so it's classed as a thermogenic fat burner. We will typically see it as tablets or capsules, often with a distinctive presentation. The contents are usually a really bright coloured yellow. New South Wales Health has put an alert out a few years ago about dinitrophenol. There are a number of fatalities and adverse health instances reported internationally in association with this compound, including this case study from Queensland, which does describe a particularly high dose of dinitrophenol and the extreme effects that it resulted in. I said we'd finish off with the cognitive enhancers. Now, these are compounds that you'll often see referred to as nootropics or smart drugs, and they have a perceived positive effect on mental skills and cognition. There's a range of different compounds that will be offered for sale online as cognitive enhancers, from the natural amino acids to some experimental or investigational synthetic drugs. Some drugs that may come to mind when you think of cognitive enhancers include caffeine, though there still seems to be some debate about that. Modafinil available in the pharmaceutical product Modvigil, and methylphenidate in Ritalin. But some of the more unusual compounds that we have seen in drug seizures include GVS 111, also known as Nupept, or omboracetam. This is a compound that was developed in the 1990s in Russia, which is a bit of a common theme with some of the cognitive enhancers and still has some medical use in Russia. We have seen it in capsule and liquid form. Now, interestingly, that bottle is consistent with a vaping liquid style presentation, and it was seized with other vaping liquids. We've seen the experimental antidepressant NSI 189, and this is a compound that's still undergoing clinical trials and is not approved for human use. Some compounds, CRL 4490 and 4491, these are related to the drug modafinil. So one is flumodafinil. It looks like it's missing a vowel, but it's actually a fluorinated version of modafinil, and fludrafinil, a fluorinated version of adrafinil. These are compounds that were patented back in 2013 and are advertised to promote alertness as a nootropic. Now, we have seen them in powders of apparent high purity, and that, I guess, creates one of the concerns with some of these cognitive enhancers. They are being offered for sale online in apparent high purity form and in powders, which potentially creates a lot of issues with dosing. And we've also seen the compound IDRA21. Now, this was something that was tested in animals in the mid-90s and is advertised to improve cognition, function, and memory. One of the compounds advertised as a cognitive enhancer that we have seen more examples of is phenibut. Now, this is also known as beta-phenyl gamma-aminobutyric acid, so related to GABA, known as beta-phenyl GABA. From a chemical structure point of view, it's also quite similar to the drug Baclofen, which is a muscle relaxant. Baclofen is just a chlorinated version of phenibut. Again, developed in Russia in 1960s, you'll often see it referred to as a cosmonaut drug because they talk about it being included in the medical packs of cosmonauts. Has a reputation as a nootropic or a mood enhancer and an anti-anxiety drug. And there have been multiple cases of emergency hospital admissions reported internationally associated with phenibut. We've certainly seen a number of cases associated with adverse health events in Queensland associated with phenibut, including the case study listed below, which refers to a group of high school students that were said to have bought a product, a powder product online. It is reported to result in fluctuating sedation and agitation, and we will typically see it in white powders, sometimes of apparent high purity, or in capsule form, maybe unlabeled, or it can be labeled as a supplement. Recently, we've also seen 4-fluorophenibut. Now, this is a compound, again, that's been advertised, offered online for sale as a potential nootropic. Okay, so just to summarize, I think we've established that mislabeling is quite a common occurrence in IPEDS in Queensland. The products will often have a professional pharmaceutical appearance. Many of these products may not be approved for human use. The reasons for mislabeling may not be clear. There may be some deliberate deception, there may be some concealment. It could also just be contamination or poor quality control in the packaging of the products. With injectable steroids, we will commonly see the substitution of a single testosterone ester for whatever's on the label. Erectile dysfunction products that are branded as natural or herbal can often contain undisclosed erectile dysfunction drugs. Melanotan 2 will often be substituted for products labeled as human growth hormone, and we can see salbutamol substituted for clenbuterol. Now, as for the other groups, there's not really any clear patterns in the mislabeling of oral steroids, anti-estrogens, SARMs, and metabolic modulators. You can see mixtures, you can see substitutions across different groups. And I think one of the most important points to note is that visually indistinguishable products may contain different drugs. So compounds, products with the same label at different periods of time, or even when obtained at the same time, may not contain the same drug. Now, there was a lot of analytical work that went into all the information for this presentation, and I'd just like to thank all of my colleagues in forensic chemistry and acknowledge all of their work that has contributed to this presentation. For those people that have the PDF, there are some links to some references there, and thank you all very much for your time.
Thanks very much for that, Karen. It's been absolutely fascinating. We've got 4 minutes for questions, and there's quite a few questions that have come through, so I'll try to get through as many as I can.
Okay.
So one that was partially answered in the chat, someone asked, are the black market products those diverted from pharmaceutical production companies, or are people making them themselves in backyard labs? So the partial answer, somebody said it was a mix of both. A pharmaceutical manufacturer may make them and then it's diverted, but there are also illicit manufacturing companies. And that led on to another question, which was, is the lab able to identify where the original sources may have come from? And are the testosterones made by the pharmaceutical companies from mixing chemicals, or are they getting them from animal sources?
Okay, that's a very good question. Our laboratory at the moment would not be looking at doing that sort of analysis, but there are other laboratories looking at different techniques such as isotope ratio mass spectrometry that may be able to get more information about the actual source of testosterone. Certainly, given that we're seeing those concealed products coming in that contain powdered steroids, and they're seen in association with carrier oils and other things that you would use to prepare the liquids for injection, that would suggest that it's happening in a, however you want to phrase it, an underground laboratory, black market sense. So I would say that a lot of the products, even if they look pharmaceutical, is not necessarily that they're coming from a pharmaceutical company anywhere. We do occasionally see with those cases just rolls of labels that could be stuck onto any vial. So
thank you. Another question was, so many fake steroids end up being injected, used by IPED clients. How switched on are people to fakes? Is one question. The other is there any way for the end user to determine the purity or contents of the vials, like testing strips or anything?
Yeah. Relating to how switched on people are to fakes, I mean, if you have a look at some of the forums and discussion, there's certainly a lot of discussion around fakes. Maya Underwood gave a really interesting insight presentation last semester, from Bro Do You Lift to Bro Do You Science, great name too. That was really interesting, talking about the scientific approach of people using IPEDS and how they assess these compounds. So I think there would be a general knowledge out there. That's probably not really my area of expertise, but I think as you see across a lot of drug classes, from counterfeit benzodiazepines, etc., there's a lot of discussion and people talking about being confident that they can tell a fake from a genuine product. In my experience, it's too difficult. So I wouldn't say that from a visual examination that it would be easy to tell a fake. Regarding other testing about purity, I'm not sure if there's any avenues open for people to look at purity of steroids now. I know that there are some steroid testing kits, like reagent testing kits. I'm not really sure of their effectiveness though. I've never tried one out, so I'm not sure how effective they are at telling different steroids.
Thanks, Karen. Another question was, for something like the Winstrol and Anavar that are used for the similar effect, does the end user realize that they're not getting what they asked for, as they're getting the result that they wanted?
Good question. Good question. How do you tell if it's just based on like, it's not necessarily even with, say, I don't know, a benzodiazepine or some other drug where someone may expect an effect within a couple of hours? You're looking at potentially long-term effects over a steroid cycle. So I don't know the answer to that. I imagine it would be quite difficult to determine whether you have got a genuine product. And certainly some of the discussion about whether some steroids aromatize and lead to more side effects than others, don't know what sort of time frame it would take for that to actually show up. So I imagine it would be quite difficult.
And I suppose just as one kind of final question was, somebody asked about, could you say more about what side effects people are trying to block by using anti-estrogen drugs when they're taking steroids?
Well, we talked about the breast tissue development, but also just if low testosterone is present, sperm production. Again, I'm going to come back to my caveat, not a doctor. I would recommend the booklet that is available for download on the Insight website really covers that really comprehensively, and they're probably better placed to discuss some of those side effects. And they also look at dosages and duration of effect. So I would recommend, I'll defer that question to the booklet on the website. It's worth downloading.